All right, how's everyone doing this afternoon? There we go, there we go. So I have one of the most exciting panels. They're all exciting panels. Every panel on the TechCrunch stage is equally exciting. But this is among the most equally exciting panels that we have on stage today, targeting one of the toughest challenges that every founder faces, recruiting. And not just recruiting, but recruiting at scale. Most startups go from 1 or 2 co-founders to a couple of early employees to 30 to 50 to 100 to 1,000 employees. And at every single stage, the recruiting process changes. And so I'm excited today to have 3 illustrious guests on stage to talk about how to recruit at scale, and how to recruit at breakneck speed. To my left here is Scott Cutler, CEO of StockX, an online secondary marketplace for sneakers, streetwear, purses, and watches. Formerly, he was at eBay for several years running global marketplaces. Next, we have Harsh Thagar of TripleByte, a marketplace for hiring engineers. He's been in the YC and Y Combinator communities for many years as a partner, and is well known for his hiring advice in that community. And finally, we have Liz Wessel, CEO and co-founder of WayUp, a platform for early career professionals to connect with new jobs. So I would like to start with you, Scott. You sort of broke the unicorn barrier. You're growing super rapidly, and you're the first unicorn to come out of Detroit in Michigan. What does a great hiring process look like to you?
Yeah, so I think you do start with, we've got a really strong value proposition in the location where we are. So we're headquartered in Detroit, although we've got business operations around the world. Detroit is going through a resurgence, and we're very much part of that. We're in the very center of that effort, and our ability as a technology company and as a global commerce company is very much dependent on our ability to hire people at scale. And we're able to do that really competitively in Detroit versus other places because we are the place to go in Detroit, and we've got amazing talent and diverse talent that we're able to choose from. But how we do that at you call breakneck speed is a real challenge. I have been associated with the company, known the company for about 3 years, but joined as a CEO just in June. Mm-hmm. We've literally grown our employee base by 25% since June.
That's
now.
incredible. Wow.
It's over 200 people that we've hired.
No summer vacation for your HR team at all.
No summer vacation. And that's across all aspects of the company, and we do that by making sure we're recruiting great talent, but focus on culture, focus on attracting the right people that are really passionate around our mission.
Got it. And Liz, you've also grown extremely rapidly yourself, but you also work with a lot of clients who are in many ways scaling up their college and early career professional programs. What does that look like to you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting difference between when we're scaling from, we were 2 5 years ago, and now we're about 70 globally, and so very big difference between that, and we do thousands of recruits for huge companies and some mid-sized companies each year. I would say, especially when it comes to early career talent, which a lot of startups are more likely to go for maybe less expensive talent, and therefore maybe they're earlier in their career. Some of the important factors I see companies do really well is when you think about what you actually need versus what are the nice to haves. And so the companies that I see do the best at scaling their recruitment are the companies that are not focused on the nice to haves. So I'll give you an example. When you say we really want competitive people for sales, a lot of the time you'll hear the misconception or this concept of well, therefore we need athletes. And those companies have a much harder time scaling their early career recruitment, let alone any recruitment, versus saying, okay, we need competitive people, so let's interview for that. So I think some of the companies that do the best are the ones that really focus on what are the must-haves for these roles versus the nice-to-have qualities that look like people I've hired in the past.
And Harsh, I think when I look at engineering recruiting, which you're focused on with TripleByte, I can't think of a profession that has more of these sort of filters, these must-haves, and there's like 20 must-haves. You must have 10 years of experience with Swift and other languages that have only been around a couple of years. So how do you sort of break through in the HR side, from your perspective, to kind of allow different types of candidates through the pipeline?
Yeah, I think what we see with engineering hiring in particular is that typically the first step in any hiring process is recruiter reviewing someone's resume or doing an initial phone call. And they're trying to get at this underlying sense of, do they have the technical skill that's required to do well in the role at the company? But the recruiters themselves often usually don't have the technical skills to be able to judge that in a way that another engineer could. So they have to use proxies to figure that out, right? And so a lot of those proxies tend to be quite crude, things like how long have I been working for, what languages do I have knowledge of, which tend to be sort of surface level knowledge, whereas engineers tend to care a lot more about like the underlying skills, which may be like not as dependent on what the most recent technology is. So I think we are seeing just an increasing interest from hiring managers and companies that are hiring technical talent in particular to do more skills assessments earlier on in the process. So how do we get at this raw underlying skill and ability as opposed to looking for crude proxies? And that's TripleByte helps with that because we built technology to screen engineers that we provide companies with. But in general, I think this direction towards how do we do more skills assessment, use that to cast a wider net and identify candidates from different kinds of backgrounds is sort of the future of hiring for technical talent in particular.
So I want to follow up on one thing there. So you talk about, how do you sort of assess people who have, experiences that you don't have, right? So if I think one of the challenges for a lot of founders is, maybe you're from a business background and you have an MBA, or maybe you have a technical background, you've never hired a marketer before. Like, how do you bridge that gap in each of your companies to hire the kinds of talent that may not already be latent in the organization? This isn't directed to anyone. So conversations.
I guess we'll go down the line.
Yeah.
I think as a founder, the one aspect is that you have a bias, whether or not you know it or not, to hire somebody that you know, somebody in your network, and you're trying to rapidly solve problems and you've got needs to solve, and so it's like just fill a body. And when in fact, when you're building a strong foundation, that's probably the last thing that you want to do. You actually need to look forward and say, what are those needs? What's the skill set? What is the spec? Hire to that, and make sure that you're aware of the unconscious bias that you have to just hire people that are exactly like you. And so you're able to, if you do that, you'll build a much stronger foundation as a company as you're scaling, and as you're scaling quickly, if you have that as a priority going into it, rather than just trying to, like, we just need to hire as many people as we can because we're growing so fast. You'll build a weak foundation that is very, very difficult to fix later.
On the specific also the specific angle of that question regarding how do you as a founder how do you assess for talent that you or skills you yourself don't have? I actually think this is really easy for founders because like one of the pros and cons, depending on how you look at it, but early on as a founder, you're essentially doing all of the roles. You're like doing some amount of sales, marketing, product, and everything. What I like to do, and something we tell within the YC community a lot, is before hiring anyone into a role, always have spent some amount of time doing that yourself. And when you're then hiring people to come in and do that, what I like to do is just make the interview process as practical as it can be. So rather than asking abstract questions, I'll be like, hey, like I'm having this problem right now on selling to customers. Like how would you solve it, and spend like a day with someone seeing what they'd actually do. And if you leave that interaction feeling like you learned something from the person, or they have insights that you don't already have, then that's probably a sign of they're the real deal.
To jump off of what both of them said, I think obviously I think both bring up great points. When you are hiring for a role though that you don't have the skill set to do, so I remember early days we wanted to hire our first data scientist, and neither JJ, who's our chief technology officer, nor I had experience with data science. So instead what we did was we said, let's go find an advisor who we really trust, whether you give them equity or not, who can assess. So I think to your point, like bringing in someone who can at least assess for those skills, that has done it before. And then I loved what Scott said, and to double click, like I cannot emphasize enough, this is no matter what size your company is, structured interviewing is by far and away one of the best ways to make sure that you're removing a lot of that bias and really running a fair process for all candidates, because structured interviewing just means you're asking the same set of questions to each of the candidates. Of course, you might add one or two based on their exact experience or based on something they say, but making sure you're assessing everyone for the same qualities and same characteristics. I see companies that are 2-person shops all the way to 200,000-person shops making this mistake of changing what they're assessing for, and it really makes recruitment much harder.
I want to pull in from what Scott and Liz was just talking about. So one of the challenges I think for a lot of founders is, at a certain point you raise funding, you got an A or B, and suddenly you're supposed to go from 20 to 100 people in the next 18 months. It's that massive growth pattern. You're under immense pressure from the board to actually grow. How do you maintain quality or maintain values or maintain the mission of an organization when really you're trying to fill out bodies? Right? How do you incentivize your HR teams in such a way? You're like, well, I need a quota. We need 8 people a month, but they've got to be the right people. I'd rather you get to 6 and get the right people than 10 with the wrong people.
I can speak from the experience of having done it wrong the first time. We had that happen right after one of our larger fundraisers, and I just remember we didn't do what I just preached. No one had told me the value of structured interviewing, and so what we didn't have was a set of interview questions that assessed for our values, what we knew made employees at Way Up successful versus not successful. And so what we have today, and we have substantially better attrition numbers than what we had 2 years ago, was that we started saying, okay, these are the values of what makes someone good at our company. Let's come up with interview questions for each one. And if someone fails the culture fit interview, and we have 2 interviewers, and you want to be selective of who you allow to be a culture fit interviewer, they have to be trained, et cetera. But once you fail, it's not a good fit. Whether we're going to hit 7 hires or 8, even if we're supposed to hit 8, you just don't do it because it's so much more expensive and mind-numbing to have to fire that person or have them quit and screw everything up than just have not hired them.
And how did you know you failed? When did you know and how did you know you had failed?
Early days, it was definitely our attrition numbers. We continued to have people who were really, really skill fit to a T and just were very negative, and as one example, and one of our values is banish negativity. And so whether it was that they weren't a culture fit and that made them negative, or whether it was that they were just a more negative person, and there are people like that who are just not more optimistic, if you will, or positive. There are people like that. I'm sure everyone can think of someone that they've met like that, and we just weren't assessing for it. And so attrition was our easiest way of figuring that out, and we really nipped it in the butt a year and a half ago.
Got it. And to go back to the metrics question, how do you think about metrics, Scott?
For
hiring.
For hiring. Let me start. Just one, add is that it's very difficult to hire and find that culture fit if you actually haven't defined what your culture is, and what your vision as a company or a mission statement is important. But then defining what your culture is really very, very important, because that becomes the screen by which you're going to hire against. On the metric side, I think you have to measure employee satisfaction. You have to be able to measure that, track regrettable attrition, to be able to have a sense of how many people you might be losing, how many people you regret losing, and really be able to understand that. But understanding that relationship between culture and then having employees or team members that are engaged and satisfied in their jobs, that's a measurable thing that you can do at a company, and you need to do to have a real pulse on whether or not you're being effective at having the right culture and the right people.
And Harsh, so I have a question. So you not only get to see, you have your own product team.
Yep.
You also get to see the data from all the product teams that also use you as your clients. How does that sort of inform how you build your company?
A bunch of ways. Actually, on the metrics question, a very specific thing that we thought a lot about is we see a lot of how different recruiting teams or just companies set up their recruiting org, their recruiting funnel, and think about the right benchmarks and right metrics to track. And we've used that to sort of form our approach to it, which is, I think, roughly there's 2 buckets of metrics that matter for hiring trajectory. One's just, are you getting enough qualified people? Are you making enough offers to qualified people? And are enough of them accepting those offers? And one thing that we've seen companies can overemphasize is that latter metric. If you focus your recruiting team heavily on what percentage of offers are being closed, it can create unintended consequences where they no longer want to engage with highly qualified candidates who they think might reject an offer, which which as a founder of a company, you're like, no, I want to just like hire the best people and I want to be taking the shots. But as a recruiting function, if you're goaling them around, hey, I want to have a 90% offer close rate, like your recruiting team is not incentivized to take any risk at all. So I think we've thought a lot about what are the right incentives, and in particular, we've tried to make sure that sort of hitting our hiring targets is not just viewed as the purview of the recruiting team only, that it's also on hiring managers to make that happen. And that's something I think some of our best customers, like Apple, Box, like we've seen like them have real success by making hiring ownership feel shared amongst like the hiring managers and recruiting teams versus just on recruiting.
When you think about kind of across the board, how do you approach a diversity in recruiting? I mean, we talked a little bit about finding candidates and addressing bias and handling sort of structured interviews, but I think a very hot topic in tech today is how do you pull from all kinds of different communities? How do you pull also remote and get out of sort of the geographies that you're sort of in? How do you approach diversity?
Happy to start on this one. We talk about this every day, all day for ourselves and for our clients. So it's the number one reason probably that companies will end up working with us, at least the larger companies. So from a diversity perspective, we think about it in a bunch of different ways. It's certainly not just gender and race. It's also the school they went to, whether they're from a big city or a coast or maybe from a more rural area. When we implemented the Rooney Rule, which is this concept of saying, I'm going to start making sure that every time I make a hire, let's say for a CTO, I'm going to meet at least one woman for that final round, or at least one person of color, whatever it might be that you consider diversity, because every company has their, I have one client who all they want is men, because they just have way too many women in STEM given the industry they're in. And so I think that it's really interesting that people a lot of the time will kind of quantify, oh, it just must be race or gender. It is so many different areas. So I think it's important for you to figure out what is diversity for your company, what are the underrepresented minorities in your company. For us, we think about it a lot because I want my marketing team, my engineering team, my product team, my sales team, and so on to represent as close to our user base as possible. And so if our user base is a third Black and Hispanic, then we should be as close to that as possible. If our user base is just over half female, we should be as close to that as possible. And we succeed in some areas, fail in others. And then I think the Rooney Rule, which is this concept of really deliberately sourcing for diversity, is a great way to help.
Yeah, I'd sort of add to that is that diversity is just not a word. I mean, you have to be committed to it. You have to be committed to it in terms of your hiring managers need to be able to represent the diversity of the workforce that you're going after. It is an opportunity to enhance value for the company if you approach it properly. It is very difficult to have diversity as a priority once you've become large, and then you're not hiring at the same rate. So if the greatest place to create the most opportunity is at the hiring. And I think one thing to think about and add to in diversity, particularly for companies that are scaling globally, like that's one of our big challenges is that we have customers in 170 different countries. And so for us, in addition to the normal things you talk about diversity, we also have to make sure that the places where we're doing business, we actually have people that are from those countries and understand the unique needs of those customers and those experiences explicitly. I'm just getting back from a trip in China. We have a big percentage of our business that's in mainland China. We're hiring, the person who's running that is from China, born, raised, educated there, and I could tell you the things that I learned. There's no way that I would be able to have that same perspective and know and understand that if we hired somebody from the West and planted them there and said, hey, we know all this market, now just go make it work there, we would lose instantaneously. So I think thinking about that even from a global perspective is important for anybody in tech because it's a global industry and most likely most companies out of the box are global and you've got to solve for that too.
We've thought about diversity, perhaps unsurprisingly given kind of what our product is, very much from the angle of how can we do more objective assessments in our own sort of screening process to identify more diverse people. And I think it's been successful for us. Empirically, like our company, like one of the core attributes of it that people who work for TripleByte comment on is that the company is tremendously diverse in like all like both across gender, ethnicity, like background, education, everything. And our approach to it was just for every role we were hiring for, figuring out what's an alternative to just asking people to submit a resume that like we could put in place, right? So we have like a content team, and instead of just asking people to send in resumes, we have like a writing assignment that's required as like part of the application process, and that's just enabled us to get people in who, if we looked at just basic their resume, we would never have engaged with. And I think as a consequence of that, we found like a great output. And so I think it's like if you're willing to invest a little bit more time up front in thinking a little bit outside the box in the sense of how can I put practical work in front of people that's not too onerous such that no one will do it, and not too onerous on us as an organization to review the output of it. But if you figure that out for each role and tailor it slightly, you can open up like a whole box of talent that wasn't available to you before.
One example that will kind of show why the TripleBytes and other screening tools of the world are so important is, especially to remove bias, is so a lot of our clients, especially big companies, will say, okay, our minimum GPA is 3.0. So people don't realize this, but by junior year, the average, at least according to Wayup's user base, which is pretty reflective of the average college student in the US, the average Asian student has a 3.3 GPA, white student has a 3.2 GPA, Black and Hispanic students have an average of 2.8 GPA. So by having a 3.0 average GPA, or GPA minimum requirement, you are failing Black and Hispanic students at a much higher rate. That certainly doesn't mean they're less smart. It typically means they're spending more time, and statistically, according to Department of Labor statistics, we know this to be true, working part-time, like doing a lot of things that honestly employers care a lot more about than how much time you spend in a library. So that's why tools like a TripleByte, which allow you to assess for how good of an engineer are they at this one language, are so much better of a predictor than something like a GPA. So we constantly are trying to push our clients away from using, back to the must-to-haves versus nice-to-haves, these kind of indicators.
I want to talk a little bit about, particularly in technical engineering, I think there's more and more of this model of, assigning small projects, little pieces, or maybe written assignments. When we talk about candidate experience, how much work should a recruiting process take to get a job? Like, how many steps should be involved? Like, how do you know that a candidate is the right candidate for your company?
We go through a pretty extensive process. The pre-screening process is critically important, and I think setting that up correctly is critical. And then, since we're hiring globally, we'll have a phone interview, we'll have a video interview, and then for most places, we actually require you to come to one of the places where you're going to be working. And it is still that last step that for us becomes critically important to understand. Not only is there cultural fit, but does this person align with our values? Does this candidate see where we're going as a company? And using sort of all of those aspects combined, is sort of the process that we go through. We also feel as though, since we're competing with, global technology companies for talent, that we have to do a lot of pitching as well to make sure that our candidates understand why we're a great place to work, and that's reflected in our cultural values. It's reflected in our vision as to where we're going as a company, and reflected by the experience that we provide when they come into our offices and see, like, hey, what is it like to work at StockX? And that's all part of ingrained into like the experience. Mm-hmm. And if it's a right match, that magic happens.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to think of the question of just like, how do you create the best experience for both sides to figure out if they're a match for each other over a long period of time? Like in a vacuum, you would argue that we wouldn't have interviews at all. Like the ideal would be you just actually try out working together for some like specified period of time, and after that you both make a call on, hey, do you want to continue this or not? In practical world, you can't actually make that happen because people don't really want to go work somewhere for a month or 2 months without knowing that it's turning into something and it's still not like perfectly representative of what it'd be like to work there. But I do see there are some companies that have made processes in that direction work. I think like Coinbase did this for a while. Weebly were famous for this, where they said, hey, like we're going to have a fairly light interviewing process, but there's a 1 week or 2 week work trial, and you have to make it through the work trial to actually get a full-time offer at the company. And what you do there is you trade off a lot more information on finding the right sort of fit for each other, but you'll have less people coming in through your funnel who are willing to do that, right? And so you can make that work if you're a really hot brand, or you've really cracked the nugget of how do I get lots of people applying to me. Like maybe I can put them through more steps. I think at their sort of peak attractiveness, Uber was sort of renowned for doing this like really extensive, intense take-home project that took days to complete, but they were like Uber, so everyone wanted to work there. But I do think there's, you can again skew in this direction of, hey, I'm going to put more work on the candidates, and that's not necessarily a bad experience. It just has a trade-off of less people will convert, and I'll have to work harder at getting more people in the top of my funnel.
And how do you feel about that trade-off specifically for you? Like, where do you draw that line?
For TripleByte, I mean, honestly, we decided that we didn't think we would be able to hire quickly enough to keep up with our growth by having a process that involved an extensive take-home project for engineers at least, right? So we sort of trusted our ability. We're also atypical here because we're hiring through the TripleByte platform itself. So we trust our product to do the pre-screening of the engineers that we're hiring, and then we have them come in for a day of on-site interviews and make our decision after that, right? And that's what and so far that's worked great for us, and that's where we landed on it.
What about you?
When it comes to candidate experience, one of the biggest things that influence a candidate is definitely your time to hire and your speed of getting back to the candidate. I cannot say enough how many, the black hole of like, if I asked you guys right now, if you applied for 10 jobs, how many would you hear back from? Usually when I ask an audience, I hear 1, 2, at most 3. And that's a terrible candidate experience. And waiting 6 months to hear back is almost as bad as just never hearing back. So I would say one of the things we really try to do for our clients, which is where the tech comes in, is how can we help you get back to every candidate within 24 hours, whether it's a good response or a bad response. And that's what we do for them. And I will say there are so many companies that help you guys recruit that you don't need to necessarily build the best-in-class recruitment team. If you work with great vendors, then you really don't need a huge recruitment team. You can try to be, I don't want to say lean, because you want to make sure your recruiters are not working day in and day out and nights and weekends, but you can rely on great tools like a TripleByte, like a WayUp, and like many other vendors out there to assist you in creating a great candidate experience.
Great. And as a reminder, you can ask questions to panelists through our TechCrunch Disrupt app. We're in the How to Hire at Breakneck Speed panel, and feel free. So I'm going to take a question from the audience right now, anonymous question, focused on where you hire geographically. You're based in Detroit, I believe. You're both, Harsh, you're here in...
We're San Francisco, yep, 2 blocks
San Francisco
away.
and
New York City.
And New York City. So we have 3 different cities. Where do you hire, and how much are you willing to consider candidates both externally who might move to headquarters as well as remote candidates?
Yeah, I mean, we have our foundation in Detroit, and so early on in the company, everybody really needed to be located in Detroit, including the operations of the company. Over time, as the company became more global and expanded rapidly, we opened up offices in New York, and then in Arizona, now in Atlanta, UK, Japan. I mean, just sort of like extended outward very, very quickly as the company became more global. And then kind of like the comments I said before, we start looking at how we're going to hire in the geographies in which we need to support our business globally, and then by function as well, because there are certain areas of the company where particular, for example, in marketing talent, in e-commerce and marketing talent, there's a lot of e-commerce performance marketing talent in the big e-commerce companies here and in Seattle. Just like one example of, we tend to have to go to places like that to find particular places where people have the scaled experience that we were looking for in that area. So geography becomes a very important point. But for us, like, Detroit still is our core. I mean, it's culturally, it's the core of our company. And so we really like people to understand why that core is so important to our culture, because it does represent so much of what we are as a brand. So we do spend a lot of time, even though we're hiring in these other places, to talk about the importance of Detroit and the importance of the mission of Detroit and how we fit into that. And it's a really great, fun story that we found very, very successful to get great talent.
Great.
I'm TrueWhite's based in the Bay Area, and the majority of the company has been hired from the Bay Area. I'd say about 25% we've relocated from elsewhere. Honestly, we haven't consciously made the effort to try and geographically diversify where we hire from. It's been largely, the efforts have all been, how do we get our name out there so that people apply to us? And sort of, it's ended up that most of the people who have applied to us have been local and near in the area. So I think it's cause and effect.
Similarly, the majority of our team is in New York, like more than 50% for sure. But some of our team leads are starting to be very purposeful about recruiting remotely. So our engineering team, we just partnered with Terminal about a year ago, and they've been fantastic for helping us recruit from Montreal. And so now the majority of our engineers are in Montreal. And so I think that more and more team leads are starting to think about how can we be more remote friendly as a team, but the times that you see it fail miserably are when they don't create the culture and the communication system to enable remote employees. So before we just say let's recruit remotely on each team, we come up with a very purposeful plan for how we're going to be successful.
And narrowing the question just a little bit, focusing on your executive teams. How important is it to have the executive team, your chief, C-suite kind of officers in one place, and how flexible can you be about having them in other places?
We haven't tried having remote execs. My initial reaction to it is I think there's a ton of value to having the execs all in the same place just for high bandwidth communication and building culture and speed of execution. But there definitely seems to be more of a trend around building remote first companies, and I'm curious to see how that does translate at the exec layer, but it's not something we've experimented with ourselves, and I have a personal preference to be old school and sort of want my execs to be in the office with us.
So right now, 100% of our execs are in New York, but it's a really interesting debate that we're having because we have one open executive position right now, and I've met a few candidates who are not willing to move to New York, and I'm really excited about them, but there's also this aspect of you're going to be the newest exec by, the most tenured execs are, several years into way up, and so you're going to be the newest exec, and you're going to be the only one remote. Are you going to feel kind of isolated? And so similarly to what you said, I doubt we'll end up making that final hire remote, although is that just perpetuating our problem of remote aspect for execs? Well, I'm not too worried about it because I'm a little old school as well, and I'm very keen on in-person interactions with my direct reports.
I guess I'm a very interesting example of this just personally because I wasn't the founder, brought in as CEO. I live in California. I commute to Detroit, commute to our other offices, quite frankly, around the world. And at the same time, I just hired a CMO, comes from California, general counsel who actually came from Detroit, stayed in Detroit, and a CFO currently. And so I'm hiring effectively a C-suite team, and it will largely be distributed. At some point, we will, we're all together at certain times where we need to be. But my expectation over time is that for us, video conferencing is so easy and so effective that we've made the investment in the technology to enable a distributed workforce, which has been critically important. If we didn't have that, there's no way that we could be effective working with our colleagues, in London as an example. A year ago, we had one person in London. Today, we have 100 people. And so, if we didn't have that ability to support just how that is going to work with sort of a home office in Detroit, we would not be able to have 100 people in London, and we would have no business there. So, having the technology to be able to do that is important. And then, as a leader, I guess I'm an example of trying to make that work, and there's definitely pros and cons, even as a CEO, as to where you are. I'm remote, but it means that I'm spending, a lot of time in Detroit for me.
Taking a question from the audience, how do you think about hiring? I'm going to reframe the question a little bit. I call it the high risk, high reward employee. So someone who may not fit all of your metrics, may not fit the general piece. Maybe it's very early in the company and you don't have the experience, but they showed up at your front door. They look like the right kind of person for your marketing position. And God, to avoid kind of a recruiting process, isn't that a miracle? Like, how do you think about those sorts of? Do you take those sorts of risks on individual candidates, or do you sort of say, look, we play it safe, we play it by the book?
I love those people, and a lot of those people have become leaders at our company. And so for me, again, it goes back to must-haves versus nice-to-haves. Typically, those types of people might not start necessarily in a managerial role, but at least they're the kinds of people who have the skills I need them to have for that position, and then they acquire a lot of the nice-to-have skills of experience, et cetera, that get them to become a manager, and eventually more than that.
Yeah, I think this question traces back to something Liz said earlier around like structured interviewing. Like I don't think you want to approach hiring from this perspective of I've got this sort of fuzzy vision of who's a good hire, who's a bad hire, and this person turned up and they sort of seem like the right stuff. I think you want a crisp rubric around for every role, like here are the skills that I'm looking for, and like nice to haves, must to haves, whatever it is. And then a high risk candidate, you have more resolution on what that means, right? Maybe that specifically means this candidate is exceptionally strong on like, technical knowledge, communication ability, but weak on management because they have no experience of it, and this role requires like coming in and managing a team of 2 people. Do I want to take that risk or not? And I think that's a level of conversation you have. And we've absolutely hired people where we're like, okay, like these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. We're going to focus on the strengths instead of the weaknesses, and it's worked out like fantastically. But I think that's what the discussion is, not sort of risk in general.
And to your point, that's where learning and development comes in, where it's like, all right, if I know this person has no years of management experience and they're going to manage one person, I need to find a really good mentor or buddy for them internally that can coach them on that.
I guess I look at it a little bit differently in the sense that the worst hire is somebody who is not self-aware and somebody who's not committed to personal development and is just inflexible. Those are risky and terrible hires and never work out. And I think for me, in terms of bringing leaders into an organization, as well as sort of functional areas, if you have, if you're taking a risk on somebody who's got, everybody has strengths and weaknesses. We all have that. You shouldn't be taking a risk on like, will this person even work out? But if you have people that are not willing to be self-aware about what they have to develop on and cannot develop, that is going to be, it's not only risky, it's going to cause way more damage than good. So I wouldn't necessarily, I don't look at it as sort of a risky or not risky decision. I think I'm looking for more of diversity of talent, understanding strengths and weaknesses, but also making sure that the people you're bringing on to work with you are committed to this notion of I'm on a personal journey to be a better person, a better leader, better employee, and understand how I'm going to do that, and then create an environment for those people to grow. That to me is the best way to get the best out of a team and a company and people, to set up that type of infrastructure, but as well as the expectation that we want you to grow as a person and work at it.
I want to talk, there's a couple of questions that I'll talk about compensation. We haven't actually talked about dollars, which is ironic talking about recruiting, but how do you think about both in terms of matching offers from other companies, being competitive in the marketplace? How do you think about compensation? And then also, when you think about retention and how you keep your employees retained, engaged, and well compensated, how do you sort of think about compensation from each of your perspectives?
So for us, when it comes to new employees, or existing employees. So we use a tool called Options Impact, which most startups who have venture capital backing can get free access to. It's one of those you give, you get. So if you give your data, you get it. And so we're able to benchmark companies that have raised in the same range of money as us, who are in the US, you can even say who are New York only, who have a similar, you could say revenue, whatever it might be. What do they pay for this type of role with this many years of experience? We love doing that, and we always want every employee at Way Up to be at average or slightly above, especially because we are a New York City company. The majority of our employees, as I mentioned, are in Manhattan. Manhattan is not a cheap place to live. I think it might be a little better than San Francisco. I'm not sure.
A little better than San Francisco.
But it's still not cheap. And so I don't want any of my employees ever having to worry about can I pay for food when I go home, or having to get a side job or 3 side jobs if they're working at Way Up.
We do exactly the same. Option Impact is great, and I think whatever tool you use, I think the framework that works well here is whatever the first offer is you make to a candidate, you want it to be based on sort of principles that you can defend. So we'll sort of we have an average percentile that we like to offer on like the cash and equity. We'll present that as a first offer. If someone comes back and it doesn't quite meet their specific needs, that's fine. We'll figure out something that works. But again, it's like hey, like this is where it comes from. Here are the bounds. This is why the bounds exist. And like if we move in this direction on equity, then maybe we move in this direction on cash or like whatever it is. But I think the key thing is we're not just like plucking numbers out of thin air, and we'll happily pay more to get great people, so long as again we can trace it back logically to here's a trade-off that we made for that.
And by the way, something big companies do a much better job at than small companies, so I cannot recommend it enough, is be transparent about your salary range up front. Like first interview, maybe second interview, you should share these things, because waiting until you get to a final round, I remember one of my first exec searches, we waited until the final round and we were like $100,000 off of one another. It was brutal. It didn't work out, as you can imagine, but that's the kind of thing that it's like 101 for recruitment.
Well, look, I'll take a little bit of a different view here. I think we're talking about attracting great people. I think it's a bigger issue to retain great people. I've seen this at scale here in the Valley. I've seen it at scale in New York as well. If at the end of the day, people are only working at your place to be able to make an equal or greater amount than somewhere else, you will not retain great people. They will leave. They'll go to the next place that offers them a little bit more money, and you'll lose an opportunity. You really need, in addition to just being competitive, you have to be able to create an environment that people are engaged and satisfied and committed to, that will be much more valuable to you as a company and to your team members and your employees than just money alone. Because there's plenty of money, there's plenty of companies that are willing to pay more. But if you make that sort of like the core focus, you will lose in the retention war, I think.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us on stage, and we'll have even more on hiring and talent on TechCrunch going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you.